My fiancé said his ex was more important than our wedding. I made him prove it. When the venue manager told me our balance hadn't been paid in 6 weeks, I laughed into the phone because I genuinely thought he'd dialed the wrong number. I had the confirmation email saved. I had the receipt. I had watched Derek transfer the money myself, sitting on our couch with his laptop open, back in March. But Colin Fitzgerald, the events director at Thornbury Hall, read me the account balance line by line, and somewhere around the third zero I stopped breathing normally. 41 days before our wedding, I found out the deposit that was supposed to secure our future had vanished, and the only name attached to the withdrawal wasn't mine. I'd been with Derek Voss for 4 years, engaged for the last 14 months, and up until that phone call I would have told anyone who asked that I trusted him completely. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, both of us reaching for the same breadbasket, both of us laughing about it for way too long. He was 32, worked in commercial real estate, drove a gray Subaru Outback he babied like a newborn, and had this habit of remembering small details about people that made everyone feel important. My mother adored him. My coworkers asked when we were finally getting married before he'd even proposed. Everything about our life together felt solid, the kind of solid you stop questioning because questioning it feels ungrateful. The early red flag, the one I explained away for months, was a name that kept surfacing whenever his phone buzzed at odd hours. Vivian. His college girlfriend, on and off for 3 years before me, the one he described as a whole chapter I closed a long time ago. She'd moved to Denver after their breakup, taken a marketing job, disappeared from his life so completely that I'd never seen a single photo of her until she resurfaced on his phone screen in January, a full year after our engagement, texting him that she was moving back to town and needed help finding an apartment. I told myself it was nothing. People help their exes move sometimes, I reasoned, especially when there's history and no bad blood. Derek assured me Vivian was just a friend now, that she'd been through a rough divorce and didn't have anyone else in the city, that helping her get settled was the decent thing to do. I wanted to be the kind of woman who trusted her fiancé without keeping score, so I didn't say much when he spent a Saturday helping her carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs instead of going with me to choose our wedding invitations. I filled out the order form alone at the kitchen table and told myself it didn't mean anything. The first real crack came in February, at our cake tasting. I'd booked it weeks in advance with a bakery 2 other couples had raved about, the kind of appointment you don't get twice without a fight. Derek texted me 40 minutes before, saying Vivian's car had broken down on the interstate and she was panicking because she didn't know anyone else in the city who could come get her. I sat alone in that bakery, tasting 5 kinds of buttercream by myself, while the owner kept glancing at the empty chair across from me, with a sympathy I didn't want. When Derek finally called that night, he sounded exhausted and grateful, like he'd done something noble, and he barely asked how the tasting went. I rationalized it the way I'd rationalized everything else. Car trouble happens. She didn't have family in the city. He'd have done the same for any friends stranded on the side of the road, I told myself, even as some small cold part of me noted that he hadn't offered to reschedule and taste cake with me the next day. That part of me got quieter every time I fed it a reasonable explanation, and reasonable explanations were the one thing Derek never seemed to run out of. By March, the pattern had a rhythm to it. Vivian needed help moving furniture, so he missed our venue walkthrough with Isabel Rohn, the wedding planner we'd hired after 3 separate friends recommended her. Isabel was patient about it, rescheduling twice, but the third time Derek canceled last minute, she pulled me aside in the parking lot and asked, gently, if everything was okay at home. I told her he was just busy with work. She nodded in a way that made it clear she didn't fully believe me, but she didn't push, and I appreciated that more than I let on, because I wasn't ready to hear what she was clearly thinking. The wedding fund was a joint account we'd opened together specifically for this, seeded with gifts from both sets of parents and 18 months of careful saving, sitting at just over $22,000 by the time we started booking vendors. Derek handled most of the transfers because he was better with spreadsheets than I was, and I trusted the arrangement the way you trust a habit you've never had a reason to question. I checked the balance occasionally, saw round numbers that matched what we'd budgeted for the venue and catering, and moved on with my life without digging deeper. That trust is exactly what let 6 weeks of missing deposits slide past me without a single alarm bell. The Thornbury Hall call changed that. I hung up with Colin Fitzgerald, my hands cold despite the warm kitchen around me, and logged into the wedding fund account for the first time in 2 months. The balance read $1,140. Where $22,000 should have been sitting, there was a trail of withdrawals I didn't recognize, dated across 5 weeks, each one a few hundred to a couple $1,000s. Memo lines left blank or marked with initials that meant nothing to me at first glance. I sat at that kitchen table for almost an hour, scrolling back through transaction history, watching our future disappear one line item at a time. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I needed proof before I said anything, because some old instinct warned me he'd have an explanation ready if I came at him with only suspicion. I screenshotted every transaction, printed the statement at the library the next morning because our home printer was out of ink, and started a folder on my laptop labeled simply, Wedding Fund. The most boring name I could think of for something that felt like it was about to blow up my entire life. My hands shook while I typed the dates into a spreadsheet, a small private echo of the woman I'd read about once who filled 12 notebook pages documenting her husband's affair, except I hadn't known that story yet. I would learn, over the following weeks, exactly how useful that kind of documentation could be. 3 days later, Derek came home from work and mentioned, almost casually, that Vivian's landlord was threatening eviction, and he'd helped her out a little to cover the gap. I asked how much. He said it wasn't a big deal, maybe a couple thousand, that he'd pay it back before the venue balance was due. I told him the venue balance had already come due, and he actually looked confused, like the math hadn't occurred to him, like the wedding had somehow become the thing he assumed would take care of itself, while Vivian's crises kept requiring immediate physical intervention. That confusion on his face frightened me more than anger would have, because it told me he genuinely hadn't been keeping track. I asked to see exactly where the money had gone, and for the first time in 4 years, Derek got defensive with me in a way that felt like a wall going up. He said I was making it sound worse than it was, that Vivian was going through the hardest year of her life, and he wasn't going to apologize for being a decent person. I said decency didn't usually come out of a joint account meant for our wedding, and he said, in a tone I'd never heard from him before, that some things were more urgent than a party, that Vivian actually needed him right now in a way that a seating chart never would. The word party landed like a slap. I went to bed that night on the far edge of the mattress, staring at the ceiling, doing math in my head that kept coming out wrong. The following week, I finally called Odalis Ferreira, a family law attorney a coworker had used during her own divorce 2 years earlier. I told her I wasn't married yet, that this wasn't technically a divorce situation, and she said that didn't matter, that engaged couples with joint accounts and vendor contracts have real financial exposure and real legal options if something goes wrong before the wedding. She had 11 years of practice specializing in domestic and premarital disputes, and she listened to my timeline without interrupting once, occasionally asking sharp, specific questions that made me realize how much I'd been avoiding asking myself. When I finished, she told me plainly that I needed documentation, not accusations, and that if the money in that account had my name on it too, I had every right to trace exactly where it went. Odalis connected me with Renata Volkov, a forensic accountant she'd worked with on contested asset cases, a woman with a CPA license and a habit of talking about spreadsheets the way other people talk about crime scenes. Renata asked for read access to the joint account and Derek's linked cards, which I still had joint authority over even if I hadn't been the one making transfers. Within 2 days, she sent back a report that turned my vague dread into cold, itemized fact. $16,850 moved out of our wedding account since January, most of it funneled into a separate account Derek had opened without telling me, and from there into rent payments, a car repair, and 2 cash withdrawals at an ATM 3 blocks from an address I didn't recognize. Vivian's address, it turned out, once I looked it up. I sat with that report for 2 full days before I said anything to him, partly because I was still hoping I'd misunderstood something, and partly because I wanted to be steady when I finally spoke. During those 2 days, I kept functioning, kept going to work, kept smiling at coworkers who asked about wedding planning, kept a version of myself running on autopilot, while the real version sat somewhere underneath, doing arithmetic on betrayal. I started recording our conversations on my phone, tucked in my jacket pocket, the microphone facing him, because some instinct told me he'd deny things later and I needed a version of the truth that couldn't be argued with. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening, the 2 of us at the kitchen table where I'd first found the missing balance. I laid Renata's report in front of him, the withdrawals highlighted in yellow, the dates lined up next to every canceled appointment and missed fitting from the past 2 months. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming behind us. When he finally looked up, he didn't deny a single number. He said Vivian had needed him, that her divorce had left her broke and alone, that he couldn't just watch someone he used to love fall apart when he had the means to help. I asked him to listen to himself, to hear how he was describing an ex-girlfriend using our wedding money, while I sat across from him planning a life he apparently wasn't fully present for. That's when he said it, the sentence that ended up on its own line in my notes, in capital letters, the one Odalis would later read aloud in a mediation room with an expression I'll never forget. He said Vivian was going through something real, something that actually mattered, and our wedding was just a party we could always reschedule. That in the grand scheme of things, she was more important right now than a hall full of flowers and a cake we hadn't even chosen because I'd gone to that tasting alone. He said it without raising his voice, almost gently, like he expected me to understand and agree. I didn't say anything for a long moment, because some part of me was busy making sure the recording in my pocket had caught every word clearly. I told him I needed space, and I meant it in the most literal sense. I packed a bag that night and drove to my sister's apartment across town, the two of us sitting on her couch until nearly midnight while I replayed the recording for her face shifting from disbelief to fury and back again. My sister, Priya Okafor, had never fully trusted Derek's easy charm, and hearing his own voice confirm every quiet suspicion she'd carried for years gave her a kind of grim satisfaction she tried and failed to hide. She told me to sleep there as long as I needed, no questions, no conditions, and I cried harder over that offer than I had over anything Derek had said, because it reminded me what unconditional support actually sounded like. The next morning, I called Odalise again, and she told me the recording, combined with Renata's financial report, put me in a genuinely strong position, both to recover the money and to protect myself going forward. She explained that because the account had both our names on it, Derek's unilateral withdrawals for a third party's personal expenses could constitute a breach of an implied financial agreement, especially given we had wedding vendor contracts signed jointly that now couldn't be fulfilled. She used the word restitution for the first time that day, and it landed in my chest like something solid to hold on to. A word that meant this wasn't just heartbreak, it was something with actual consequences attached. Isabel, the wedding planner, called me later that same week, her voice careful, asking if she should pause vendor confirmations given the missed venue payment Colin had flagged to her directly. I told her everything, more than I probably needed to, and she went quiet for a moment before saying she'd suspected something was wrong for weeks, that she'd seen this exact pattern with two other couples in her 12 years planning weddings, one partner slowly checking out while blaming an outside crisis for every missed obligation. She offered to put together a formal written record of every canceled appointment and missed payment deadline, dated and detailed, saying it might be useful for whatever came next. I hadn't asked her to do that. She did it anyway, unprompted, because she said watching brides get blindsided like this made her furious in a way 12 years hadn't dulled. I also reached out to Dr. Naomi Kessler, a licensed marriage and family therapist a friend had seen during her own broken engagement, mostly because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Dr. Kessler had been practicing for 19 years, specializing in relationship trauma and financial infidelity, a term I hadn't even known existed until she used it in our first session. She explained that money diverted secretly to someone outside the relationship follows almost the same psychological pattern as a physical affair, the same secrecy, the same erosion of trust, the same slow replacement of one partner's needs with another's. Hearing a professional name what had happened to me, giving it a category instead of leaving it as some shapeless private humiliation, did something for my nervous system that I hadn't expected words could do. Derek texted me every day that week, apologetic at first, then increasingly frustrated, insisting I was overreacting, that he'd already told Vivian he needed to slow down helping her, that we could still fix the wedding timeline if I just came home and talked to him like an adult. I didn't respond to most of it, following Odalise's advice to keep communication limited and, where possible, in writing through her office instead. The one time I did call him back, he spent most of the conversation defending Vivian's character, telling me she'd never asked him for money outright, that he'd offered it himself because he couldn't stand seeing her struggle. I asked him if he understood that was actually worse, and he went quiet in a way that told me he genuinely hadn't considered it from that angle. I hired Desmond Aldridge, a licensed private investigator with a background in financial cases, mostly to confirm what I already suspected, but needed independently verified for my own peace of mind. Desmond spent 4 days pulling together a report on Vivian's recent history, and what came back reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't anticipated. Vivian hadn't just reconnected with Derek out of desperation after a divorce. She'd done something almost identical with another engaged man 2 years earlier in Denver, a relationship that had ended his engagement 6 weeks before his wedding date under strikingly similar circumstances, according to public records and a brief, painful phone call Desmond made to that man with his permission. That call changed something in me. The man's name was Callum Reyes, and when Desmond patched him through to speak with me directly, his voice carried the flat, exhausted tone of someone who'd rebuilt his life once already, and hadn't expected to hear this story repeating itself for somebody else. He told me Vivian had a talent for finding men who were already emotionally available but structurally busy. Engaged men whose attention was divided between wedding logistics and everyday work. and positioning herself as the one crisis they couldn't ignore. He said by the time he figured out what was happening, he'd already lost $9,000 and, more painfully, 3 months he could never get back with a fiancé who'd stopped waiting for him to choose her. I didn't tell Derek about Callum right away. I sat with that information for 2 days, feeling something shift from raw grief into something colder and more useful. A clarity I hadn't had access to while I was still hoping this was a temporary lapse in judgment, rather than a pattern he'd walked into with his eyes half open. Odalis agreed to include Desmond's findings as supplementary material, not for court since nothing here was criminal, but for the settlement conversation she was already preparing to have with Derek and his family about the wedding fund and the broken vendor contracts we'd both signed. The crisis peaked on a Thursday, 11 days before the wedding date we'd originally planned, when Colin from Thornbury Hall called to say the venue would release the date to another couple by end-of-day Friday, unless the remaining balance was paid in full. I had less than 24 hours to either come up with over $8,000 myself, walk away from a wedding I no longer wanted, or force Derek to make good on money he'd already given to someone else. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I sat in Odalis's office that afternoon, the two of us working the phones, trying to figure out which option protected me the most. Odalis made the call herself, direct to Derek, laying out in plain legal language that the joint funds diverted without my consent created a debt he owed me personally, separate from whatever he'd promised Vivian, and that failing to restore at least the venue balance within 24 hours would be documented as a bad faith breach she was fully prepared to pursue through small claims court. Recording and financial report both entered as exhibits. I sat in the chair across from her desk, listening to her voice stay level and precise the entire call, watching her write notes in handwriting so neat it looked typed, and understood for the first time what it actually meant to have someone competent in your corner. Derek called me directly 40 minutes later, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard, saying he could get most of the money back from Vivian if I gave him a few more days, that she'd understand, that this was salvageable if I just trusted the process one more time. I told him I was done trusting a process that had already cost me $22,000 and a wedding date, and I hung up before he could answer. That was the first time in our entire relationship I'd hung up on him first, and something about doing it steadied my hands enough to sign the paperwork Odalis slid across the desk a few minutes later. The paperwork that would formally cancel the engagement and open a restitution claim against the joint account. By Friday morning, Derek showed up at my sister's apartment unannounced, standing on the sidewalk below her third-floor window, calling my name like this was a scene from a movie he'd seen once. My sister went down instead of me, and through the window I watched her hand him an envelope Odalis had prepared, a formal notice detailing the restitution demand, and a request that all further communication go through her office. He tried to argue with my sister for almost 10 minutes before finally getting back in his car, and I watched the whole thing from above, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet, which was relief instead of grief. He paid back $6,200 within the week, apparently by borrowing from his mother, Judith Voss, who called me directly a few days later, her voice thick with an embarrassment that felt genuine even through my anger. Judith told me she'd had no idea about Vivian's return until the venue crisis forced Derek to explain himself to the entire family at once, and she apologized on behalf of a son she said she'd raised better than this. She offered, unprompted, to cover the remaining balance herself rather than let the debt drag out through small claims court, and Odalis later confirmed the full amount landed in my account 8 days after the original venue deadline, a technical resolution that felt less like a victory and more like closing a book I'd been forced to finish reading. The wedding never happened, obviously, though the ripple effects took longer to settle than the money did. Isabel's written record of missed appointments, combined with Renata's financial report, became the backbone of the restitution claim Odalis filed, and within 6 weeks the matter closed with a signed agreement, full repayment, and language explicitly prohibiting Derek from contacting me except through legal counsel if any disputes arose later. Colin at Thornbury Hall, upon hearing the short version of what happened, quietly waived the cancellation fee we technically owed for backing out of the contract, telling me over the phone that he'd seen enough weddings collapse over the years to recognize which ones deserved a little mercy on the way out. Derek's job situation deteriorated around the same time, though not because of anything I did directly. His manager, a man named Otis Bramwell, who I'd met exactly twice at company events, called me out of professional courtesy after learning through mutual acquaintances what had happened, mostly to ask, delicately, whether any company resources had been involved in the situation with Vivian, since it turned out she'd briefly worked at a marketing firm that partnered with Derek's company. I told Otis honestly that I didn't know the details of his work life anymore, and didn't especially want to, but he thanked me anyway, and I later heard through the same mutual acquaintances that Derek's performance reviews took a noticeable hit that quarter, his manager citing distraction and missed deadlines that lined up almost exactly with the timeline Renata had documented. Vivian, for her part, left the city again less than 2 months after the engagement officially ended, according to my sister, who still kept loose tabs on the situation through people we both knew. Apparently, she'd told mutual friends that Derek had become too intense once the wedding fell through, too focused on rebuilding something with her that she'd never actually promised him, and she wanted a fresh start somewhere without complicated history following her around. I felt an ugly little flicker of satisfaction hearing that, the same flicker I imagine everyone feels when karma arrives a little faster than expected, and I let myself have it without much guilt. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment near my sister's place by the end of that same month, furnishing it slowly with things that were entirely mine, no negotiated compromises, no joint accounts, no shared future requiring anyone else's cooperation to protect. Dr. Kessler and I kept meeting weekly for a while, working through what she called the specific grief of losing a future you'd already started building, distinct from ordinary heartbreak because you're mourning plans, not just a person. She told me in one session that financial infidelity survivors often take longer to trust their own judgment again than survivors of physical affairs, because the betrayal hides inside something as mundane as a bank statement, something you're supposed to be able to check without fear. 4 months after everything ended, my company promoted me to a senior analyst role I'd been quietly working toward for over a year, the timing almost comically ironic given how much of that year I'd spent distracted by wedding planning I no longer needed to think about. I used part of the restitution money, the part I hadn't already spent covering rent during the transition, to finally take the solo trip to the coast I'd always wanted, and never quite prioritized while I was busy building a life around someone else's crises. I sat on a rented balcony that overlooked the water for 4 straight days, reading paperback novels, answering to absolutely no one, and realized somewhere around the second evening that I hadn't checked my phone anxiously in almost 72 hours. 6 months out, my sister told me over dinner that Derek had reached out to a mutual friend asking if I'd ever consider talking again, saying he'd finally gone to therapy himself and understood now what he'd done wrong. I felt almost nothing hearing it, which surprised me more than anger would have. A flat, settled calm that told me the healing Dr. Kessler had promised was actually arriving, slowly, on its own schedule. I didn't respond, didn't ask my sister to pass along a message, didn't need the closure that conversation might have offered because I'd already built my own closure out of spreadsheets, recordings, and a lawyer who believed me before I fully believed myself.